Welcome to your deep dive. This time we're exploring the world of strategy,
Oh, fun.
pulling wisdom from military history and beyond.
Okay.
You've given us a really interesting mix of sources, including excerpts from Robert Greene's
Yeah,
The 33 Strategies of War, which seems to be a favorite of yours.
that's right. Yeah, it is. And it looks like you're interested in understanding
Mm-hmm.
how this kind of strategic thinking can be applied, not just on the battlefield,
Right, yeah.
but in everyday life, too.
Exactly. So we're going to unpack some key strategies, learn from fascinating
Right.
historical figures, and by the end, you'll have a whole new mental toolkit
Sounds good.
for tackling any challenge. But before we jump into specific strategies,
Yeah.
let's take a step back and define what we actually mean by
Okay.
strategy. It's a word we hear all the time, but what's the core concept?
Yeah, it's interesting to look at the origins of the word itself.
Okay.
Strategy comes from the ancient Greek word strategos,
Hmm.
meaning leader of the army. So it's rooted in military thinking,
Makes sense.
this idea of leading and directing forces towards a larger objective.
Makes sense. But obviously, we're not talking about actual armies here.
Right.
So how does this military concept of strategy translate to, say,
Mhm.
achieving a personal goal or navigating a tricky situation at work?
That's where the difference between strategy and tactics comes in.
Yeah.
Strategy is the big picture, the long-term vision.
Okay.
It's about identifying your goals, understanding the landscape you're operating in,
Yeah.
and developing a plan to get where you want to go.
Mm-hmm.
Tactics, on the other hand, are the specific actions you take
Right.
to execute that plan.
Uh-huh.
They're more immediate and situational.
Okay. So strategy is the why and
Right.
tactics are the how.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of us get caught up in the day-to-day, the how,
Yeah,
without really taking the time to step back and think about the why.
absolutely. Yeah, we get bogged down in the tactical details
Yeah.
and lose sight of the larger strategic goals. That's why it's so important to cultivate that strategic mindset,
Yeah.
to regularly elevate yourself above the immediate situation and ask, where am I trying to go? What are the key obstacles?
Right.
And how can I best position myself to overcome them?
That's a great point.
Thanks.
And speaking of obstacles, Robert Greene talks a lot
Yeah.
about the importance of identifying your enemies.
Mm-hmm.
But he's not just talking about literal enemies, is he?
No, not at all. In Greene's framework, an enemy can be anything that stands in the way
Yeah.
of your goals.
Right.
It could be a bad habit, a limiting belief, procrastination,
Yeah.
even a toxic relationship,
Right.
anything that holds you back from reaching your full potential.
So it's about taking that honest, sometimes uncomfortable look at
Yeah.
what's really preventing us from moving forward.
Exactly. And Greene has a brilliant strategy for this.
Okay.
Strategy. #2. Do not fight the last war.
I like that.
It's about recognizing that dwelling on past failures
Mm-hmm.
or clinging to outdated strategies
Mm-hmm.
can sabotage your success.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be present-focused, willing to adapt,
Yeah.
and constantly evolve your approach.
You need to be able to let go of what's no longer serving you, even if it feels familiar
Right.
or comfortable.
Totally.
That resonates with me. I know I've definitely been guilty of holding on to old habits
Oh, for sure.
and patterns, even when they're not working anymore.
It's a common trap.
Yeah.
But by being aware of this tendency, you can start to break free
Right.
from those self-imposed limitations.
I like that.
Now, Greene also emphasizes the importance
Yeah.
of maintaining mental clarity and composure
Okay.
under pressure.
Mm.
He calls this strategy #3. Amidst the turmoil of events, do not lose your presence of mind.
Which I imagine is easier said than done.
Yeah.
Life throws us curveballs all the time. How do we stay calm and collected when
Me-
everything feels like it's falling apart?
Well, Greene tells the fascinating story of General George Patton, known for his incredible presence of mind on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out Patton deliberately exposed himself to situations
Oh, wow.
that triggered his fear.
Yeah.
He even envisioned his ancestors watching and judging his courage.
Wow, that's intense.
Yeah,
But I guess by repeatedly facing his fears, he desensitized himself to them.
exactly. It's similar to the concept of exposure therapy.
Okay.
By gradually exposing yourself to what you fear, you diminish its power over you.
Right.
Patton used this to cultivate an almost superhuman level of calmness under pressure.
That's an extreme example, but I can see how the underlying principle applies
Yeah.
to everyday life,
Right.
whether it's a big presentation at work or a difficult conversation you're dreading.
Mm.
the more familiar you become with those uncomfortable
Yeah.
feelings, the less they'll control your actions.
Precisely. Now, not all of us need to take Patton's approach and charge into battle,
Right.
metaphorically speaking, of course.
Yeah.
There are gentler methods for developing mental toughness. For instance, the story of the tea master and the samurai.
Oh, I've heard of this.
Yeah,
Wasn't there a duel involved?
there was. The
Yeah.
tea master was challenged to a duel
Yeah.
by a samurai and was absolutely terrified. His
Mm-hmm.
teacher,
Mm.
recognizing his fear,
Yeah.
advised him to focus on the simple act of making a perfect cup of tea before the duel.
Making tea, that's a pretty unexpected way to prepare for a life or death situation.
Right. But it's all about redirecting your mental energy.
Okay.
When fear takes over,
Mm-hmm.
our imaginations run wild. We get caught in a spiral of
Huh.
worst-case scenarios.
Yeah.
But by focusing on a simple, calming ritual,
Yeah.
you can regain control of your mind and quiet those anxieties.
So it's about shifting your attention away from the source of your fear
Right.
towards something you can control.
Yeah.
Something that brings you back to the present moment. That's something I think anyone can apply.
Absolutely. The next time you're feeling overwhelmed or anxious, try taking a few minutes to engage in a calming activity.
Right.
It could be anything.
Right.
Organizing your desk, taking a walk, listening to music,
Yeah, yeah.
even making a cup of tea.
Hitting that mental reset button.
Exactly.
So we've talked about identifying enemies,
Mm-hmm.
mental toughness, but how do we actually get things moving?
Yeah.
How do we overcome that initial inertia
Right.
and translate intention into action?
Well, that's where Robert Greene's death ground strategy comes in.
Okay.
It's strategy, #4.
All right.
And it's all about creating a sense of urgency.
Okay.
Greene argues that the illusion of limitless time
Mm-hmm.
can lead to complacency and wasted opportunities.
Yeah.
We tell ourselves, we'll get to it later.
Oh, yeah.
But later often never comes.
Oof. I feel personally attacked by that statement.
Right.
The procrastination struggle is real.
It is. We've all been there.
Yeah.
But by putting yourself on death ground,
Yeah.
metaphorically speaking,
Mm-hmm.
you eliminate that escape route. You create a sense of urgency that forces you to take action.
Okay. I'm intrigued, but do you have a real-world example of this?
Of course.
Preferably one that doesn't involve, well, actual death.
Of course.
Mm.
Think of Hernan Cortez,
Okay.
a Spanish conquistador.
Okay.
When he landed in Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
he was facing a much larger and more powerful Aztec army.
Right.
To motivate his men and eliminate any thought of retreat,
Okay.
he did something pretty drastic. He burned his ships.
He burned his ships.
Yeah.
Talk about commitment.
Yeah.
But I guess that really does create a sense of no going back.
It does. His men knew there was no other option but to conquer or perish.
Wow.
That level of commitment and urgency, that feeling of being all in,
Mm-hmm.
can be incredibly powerful.
Right.
It cuts through hesitation and forces you to focus on the task at hand.
That's an incredible story, but
Right.
obviously we're not suggesting anyone literally burn their bridges.
No.
How can we apply this concept of death ground to our own lives in a safe
Yeah.
and productive way?
Well, think about a goal you've been putting off.
Okay.
Ask yourself, what would happen if I had to achieve this in the next month?
Okay.
What steps would I need to take? What sacrifices would I need to make?
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works. It's about creating those self-imposed constraints, those deadlines that force us to prioritize and take action. It's like if you have forever to do something, you'll probably never actually get around to it.
Right.
But if you give yourself a tight deadline, suddenly you find a way to make it happen.
Exactly. That's the power of the death ground strategy.
Yeah.
It's about creating that sense of urgency,
Right.
that now or never mentality
Mm-hmm.
that propels you forward. You can set a firm deadline, make it public,
Okay.
tell people about your goal,
Right.
or even create a psychological death ground by eliminating your safety net.
Uh-huh.
If you really want to shake things up, you could quit that job you hate
Wow.
or leave that relationship that's no longer serving you.
There's definitely a certain freedom that comes with burning those metaphorical bridges.
Yeah.
It forces you to confront your fears and move forward,
Yeah.
even if it's scary. But I think we also need to talk about what happens when we do encounter those metaphorical enemies.
Mm-hmm.
When conflict becomes inevitable,
Right.
what strategies can we use to navigate those situations?
Well, one approach is to cultivate a reputation that deters potential adversaries in the first place.
Okay.
Greene calls this strategy #10. Create a threatening presence.
Gotcha.
The idea is that by projecting an aura of strength, unpredictability,
Mhm.
and even a touch of craziness, you can discourage others from attacking you.
So it's about making people think twice before messing with you.
Exactly. And it doesn't mean you have to be aggressive or confrontational.
Right.
It's more about having a strong sense of self, clear boundaries, and a willingness to stand up for yourself. Think of Margaret Thatcher, for example.
Yeah.
She was a polarizing figure, but that was part of her power.
Okay.
She wasn't afraid to make enemies, and that made her supporters even more loyal.
That makes sense. It's like that saying, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything.
Totally.
Thatcher knew what she believed in, and she wasn't afraid to fight for it.
Yeah.
And while some people might disliked her, they certainly respected her strength of will.
Right. And that unwavering conviction, that sense of purpose, can be a powerful deterrent.
Right.
People may not agree with you, but they'll respect your authenticity and your commitment to your values.
Okay, so having a strong presence can help deter enemies. But what about when conflict is unavoidable?
Right.
What strategies can we use to actually engage in those battles effectively?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
And we'll dive into some specific strategies for navigating conflict when we come back after a quick break.
Sounds good. Stay tuned. We'll be back with part 2 in just a moment.
Welcome back. We've been talking about defining strategy and cultivating that strategic mindset, identifying your enemies, honing your mental toughness, and creating a sense of urgency.
Right.
Now let's explore some specific strategies for handling conflict.
Okay.
We left off talking about what happens when conflict becomes unavoidable.
Right. And sometimes the most strategic move is actually to step back from a conflict.
Okay.
To disengage rather than engaging head on. Robert Greene calls this strategy #11.
Okay.
Trade space for time, the non-engagement strategy.
Non-engagement. Isn't that kind of counterintuitive? It seems like our instinct is usually to fight back, to defend our position.
It definitely goes against our natural inclination to fight, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But think about it this way. Retreating isn't always a sign of weakness.
Okay.
In fact, it can be a clever way to buy time, to recover, to gain a better understanding of the situation, and to ultimately plan a more effective countermove. So it's about choosing your battles carefully.
Right.
Not wasting energy on conflicts that don't really matter in the long run.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it's also about recognizing that sometimes doing nothing is the most powerful action you can take. By refusing to engage on your opponent's terms.
Okay.
You can disrupt their plans and force them to reevaluate their strategy.
Right.
This can lead to them making mistakes, overextending themselves, or even giving up altogether.
That's fascinating. Do you have any examples of this kind of strategic retreat working in real life?
Absolutely. One of the most striking examples is the story of Mao Zedong.
Okay.
During the Chinese Civil War.
All right.
He was facing a power struggle within the Communist Party.
Okay.
And strategically retreated from the urban centers.
Okay.
Allowing his rivals, the 28 Bolsheviks, to take control. He knew their aggressive confrontational tactics would eventually lead to their downfall.
So he was playing the long game, biding his time until the situation shifted in his favor.
Exactly. And it worked. The 28 Bolsheviks pushed for a direct confrontation with the nationalists, which weakened their position.
Right.
Meanwhile, Mao retreated to the countryside and built up his support among the peasantry. Eventually, he was able to regain control and lead the communists to victory.
That's incredible. It really highlights the importance of patience and discipline in strategic thinking.
Yeah.
Sometimes the best way to win is to not fight at all, at least not immediately.
Exactly. And it's a strategy that can be applied to many situations.
Okay.
Dealing with a difficult boss.
Yeah.
Don't engage in a power struggle.
Right.
Give them space. Let them make their own mistakes. And focus on building your own support network. Negotiating a deal. Don't be afraid to walk away from the table if the terms aren't favorable.
Right.
Sometimes the best way to get what you want is to create a sense of scarcity. To make the other party realize they need you more than you need them.
That's a really empowering perspective. It reminds me of the saying,
the greatest victory is that which requires no battle.
I love that.
So we've explored the wisdom of retreating strategically. Now let's shift gears and talk about what happens when it is time to take the offensive.
Okay.
How can we use speed and surprise to our advantage?
That's where Robert Greene's Blitzkrieg strategy comes in.
Okay.
It's strategy #14 in his book.
Right.
And it's all about overwhelming your opponent with speed and suddenness, leaving them no time to react.
It's like catching them completely off guard before they even know what hit them.
Exactly. Napoleon was a master of this on the battlefield.
Okay.
He would move his troops with incredible speed, appearing in unexpected places,
Right.
and attacking before his enemies had a chance to organize their defenses.
So it's not just about being fast, but about being unpredictable as well,
True.
keeping your opponents constantly guessing.
Precisely. And this principle can be applied to all sorts of situations, launching a new product.
Don't give your competitors time to copy you or come up with a counter strategy.
Right.
Get it to market quickly and decisively, negotiating a deal.
Yeah.
Make a bold offer, something unexpected that disrupts the other party's expectations.
Okay.
The element of surprise can give you a huge psychological advantage.
Yeah.
It makes your opponents feel off balance and reactive,
Right.
giving you the upper hand.
It's like that element of surprise in a magic trick.
Yeah.
You distract the audience, then bam,
Right.
you pull a rabbit out of a hat before they even know what happened.
Totally.
But while speed and surprise can be powerful tools,
Yeah,
sometimes we need a more subtle, more nuanced approach, right?
absolutely.
Right.
That's where Robert Greene's forcing strategies come in.
Okay.
Remember strategy, #15.
Yeah.
It's about controlling the overall dynamic of a situation, influencing your opponent's emotional state, rather than trying to dictate their every move.
Right.
Think of it like a game of chess. You don't win by controlling every single piece. You win by controlling the board,
Right.
shaping the overall flow of the game.
So it's about setting the stage, creating a situation where your opponent almost inevitably makes the moves you want them to make.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And it requires a deep understanding of human psychology.
Okay.
You need to be able to anticipate your opponent's reactions,
Right.
to understand their motivations and fears, and to use that knowledge to subtly nudge them in the direction you want them to go.
It's like being a master puppeteer, pulling the strings without anyone noticing.
Exactly. A fantastic example of this is the story of Mae West
Okay.
and her battles with Paramount Studios.
Right.
She wanted more creative control over her films,
Okay.
but knew she couldn't simply demand it.
Right.
So she started by playing the blonde bombshell role, charming the studio executives,
Okay.
making them think they were in control.
Okay.
Then she strategically escalated her demands,
Right.
making it clear she was willing to walk away from the project if she didn't get her way.
Wow. So she used their own assumptions about her against them,
Right.
turning their expectations into a tool for negotiation.
Exactly. It was a brilliant strategy, and it worked. Paramount eventually caved to her demands because they didn't want to lose their star actress.
Right.
It highlights the fact that even in situations where you seemingly have less power,
Yeah.
you can still control the dynamic if you play your cards.
Right. That's a powerful lesson. It shows that understanding your opponent's psychology is just as important as understanding the tactical situation.
For sure.
Now, we've talked about retreating strategically, using speed and surprise and controlling the dynamic.
Right.
But what about when we need a more aggressive, more direct approach?
Okay.
What about the situations where we need to completely dismantle our opponents?
Well, that brings us to Robert Greene's annihilation strategy,
Okay.
which he outlines as strategy, #19. It's about completely enveloping your opponent,
Yeah.
cutting off all their escape routes and crushing their will to resist. Think of it like a boa constrictor slowly squeezing its prey.
That's a pretty intense image. When would you actually use a strategy like this? It sounds pretty ruthless.
It's definitely a strategy of last resort, to be used only when all other options have been exhausted
Right.
and when the stakes are extremely high. And while we don't condone unethical behavior,
Yeah.
there are certainly historical examples of this strategy being used effectively.
Okay.
John D. Rockefeller, the oil tycoon, was a master of this.
Okay.
He used his wealth and influence to systematically buy up pipelines and railroads,
Okay.
cutting off his competitors' access to transportation and distribution.
So he essentially created a monopoly, controlling the entire industry by controlling its infrastructure.
Exactly. And while Rockefeller's methods were often controversial, they were undeniably effective.
Yeah.
He understood that in some cases, total domination is the only way to secure a lasting victory.
That's a sobering thought. It makes you realize that strategy isn't always about playing nice. Sometimes it's about making tough choices, even ruthless choices, to achieve your objectives. But before we get too carried away with these ideas of domination and annihilation,
Sure.
perhaps we should talk about a more subtle, more strategic approach to outmaneuvering your opponents.
Okay.
What about making them essentially destroy themselves through their own actions?
Ah, you're talking about the art of one-upmanship.
Yeah.
It's not explicitly one of Robert Greene's 33 strategies,
Okay.
but it's a classic tactic that has been used throughout history to undermine rivals
Right.
and gain a strategic advantage.
I like the sound of that. Tell me more.
The goal of one-upmanship is to subtly manipulate your opponents,
Okay.
to exploit their weaknesses and insecurities, and ultimately lead them to make self-destructive decisions.
Okay.
It's about planting those seeds of doubt and watching them grow into a forest of paranoia,
Right.
poor judgment.
It sounds deliciously devious. Do you have any examples of this strategy in action?
Certainly. One of the best examples is the story of General Ulysses S. Grant
Okay.
and his rival, General John McClernand.
Okay.
During the Civil War,
All right.
McClernand was ambitious and eager for personal glory.
Okay.
He desperately wanted to be the one to capture Vicksburg,
Mm-hmm.
a key Confederate stronghold.
Right.
Grant, being the shrewd strategist that he was,
Yeah.
recognized this weakness and used it to his advantage.
So how did he do it? Did he trick McClernand into making a mistake?
In a way, yes. He deliberately delayed sending McClernand reinforcements,
Oh, wow.
knowing this would frustrate him and make him act rashly.
Okay.
McClernand, desperate to prove himself,
Yeah.
rushed into battle prematurely
Mm-hmm.
and ended up making a series of costly mistakes that ultimately benefited Grant's campaign.
So Grant essentially used McClernand's own ambition against him, turning his desire for glory into a weapon.
Exactly. Grant understood that McClernand's ego was his Achilles heel. By subtly manipulating the situation,
Right.
he was able to outmaneuver his rival and secure a victory for himself and the Union Army.
That's a brilliant example of psychological warfare. It shows that understanding your opponent's personality and motivations
Yeah,
is just as important as understanding the tactical situation.
for sure.
But this one-upmanship strategy sounds like it requires a certain level of ruthlessness. Is it always ethical to manipulate people in this way?
That's a good question. And it's important to remember that we're not advocating for unethical behavior.
Right.
The key is to use these strategies wisely and judiciously.
Okay.
The goal is not to destroy people, but to outsmart them,
Right.
to achieve your objectives while minimizing unnecessary harm.
Mm.
Remember, true strategic brilliance lies in finding ways to create win-win situations whenever possible.
That's a good point. It's about being strategic, not malicious.
Yeah.
It's about achieving your goals without compromising your values.
For sure.
We've covered so much ground today, from the wisdom of strategic retreat to the power, speed, and surprise,
Yeah,
to the subtle art of one-upmanship.
absolutely.
It's fascinating to see how these principles from military history can be applied to all areas of life.
I agree. And it's important to remember that strategy is not about blindly following a set of rules.
Right.
It's about being adaptable, creative, and always thinking one step ahead. It's about using your mind as your most powerful weapon.
And with that, we'll wrap up part 2 of this deep dive. We'll be back soon with part 3
Okay?
to explore even more fascinating strategic insights,
It's good.
including the power of the unexpected and the importance of understanding your enemy.
Until then, keep strategizing.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the world of strategy. It's been quite a journey so far, hasn't it?
It really has.
We've covered a lot of ground, from retreating to advance to manipulating your opponents through one-upmanship. But before we wrap things up,
Yeah.
there are a couple more fascinating strategies we need to explore.
You're right. And I think it's time we address something
Okay.
that is absolutely fundamental to effective strategy,
Right.
but often gets overlooked. We've talked a lot about understanding ourselves.
Yeah,
But what about understanding our opponents?
that makes sense. It seems like even the most brilliant plan could fall apart
Right.
if you don't truly understand who you're dealing with.
Exactly. You can have all the tactical knowledge in the world.
Right.
But if you misjudge your opponent's motivations, their strengths, their weaknesses, their likely responses, your strategy is going to be off target.
It's like trying to navigate a maze in the dark. You might stumble around for a bit,
Right.
but you're unlikely to find the exit without a clear understanding of the layout.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks.
And this is where Robert Greene's intelligence strategy comes in.
Okay.
It's strategy #17 in his book, The 33 Strategies of War.
Right.
And it emphasizes the importance of gathering information,
Okay.
not just about your opponent's resources or their position, but about their psychology, their decision-making process, even their fears and aspirations.
So it's not just about knowing what they have, it's about understanding who they are, how they think. That's pretty deep.
It is. And Greene argues that the best way to do this is to become a student of human nature,
Okay.
a keen observer of people. Pay attention to their body language, their tone of voice, the subtle cues they give off, both consciously and unconsciously.
It's about learning to read between the lines.
Right.
Picking up on those unspoken messages that reveal what's really going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. And this doesn't mean you have to become some sort of master spy or interrogator.
Right.
It's about being more present in your interactions.
Yeah.
More attentive to the details.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the more traditional aspect of information gathering.
Okay.
Research, asking questions, seeking out insights from those who might have a different perspective.
It's about being proactive, not just waiting for information to come to you, but actively seeking it out. I like that. And this all ties back to the idea of being adaptable.
Right.
The more you know about your opponent, the more flexibility you have to adjust your strategy as needed.
Precisely. Napoleon was a master of this.
Okay.
He was constantly gathering intelligence, interviewing prisoners of war.
Wow.
Studying enemy maps and dispatches, even sending spies into enemy camps.
Wow, he really did his homework.
He did. He knew that knowledge was power, especially in the realm of strategy.
Right.
The more you know about your opponent,
Yeah.
the more effectively you can anticipate their moves, exploit their weaknesses, and ultimately shape the outcome to your advantage.
Okay, so understanding your opponent is crucial. But at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I have to ask, how does this connect back to the idea of understanding ourselves?
Yeah, great question.
Is there a link between those two?
There absolutely is.
Okay.
In fact, I'd say self-awareness is one of the most underrated elements of strategic thinking. You need to understand your own strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
Your biases, your blind spots, those emotional triggers that can make you act impulsively or irrationally.
Because if you don't understand your own tendencies, how can you possibly hope to predict and understand someone else's?
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. And the more self-aware you become, the better you'll be able to manage your own emotions, to control your reactions, and to make decisions that are truly in your best interest.
Right.
It's like that ancient Greek wisdom, know thyself.
Yeah.
It's fundamental to strategy in any context.
So bringing it all together, we've covered identifying enemies, mental toughness, creating urgency, deterrence, non-engagement, speed and surprise, controlling the dynamic, envelopment, one-upmanship, understanding your enemy, understanding yourself.
Right.
It's been an incredible deep dive into the world of strategy.
It has.
But before we wrap things up, is there one final, perhaps unexpected, strategic insight?
Yes. You'd like to leave our listener with?
There is. Remember that North Vietnamese blooming lotus strategy we touched on earlier?
I do.
I think it deserves a bit more attention because it exemplifies a truly unconventional approach to strategy.
I remember you describing it as influencing a situation from within. Instead of attacking head-on, you infiltrate your opponent's defenses.
Right.
Almost like a Trojan horse.
That's a great way to put it. It's a strategy that often gets overlooked.
Okay.
Because it requires a different mindset, a willingness to play the long game. You're not looking for a quick victory. You're looking to subtly shift the balance of power over time.
So how does it actually work? Can you give an example?
Imagine you're trying to bring about change within a large organization.
Okay.
A direct, confrontational approach might meet with resistance, even hostility.
Right.
But what if you instead focus on building relationships, on understanding the internal dynamics, on subtly influencing key decision makers?
Over time, you can start to shift the culture, the values, even the goals of the organization from within, without ever having to engage in open warfare.
That's fascinating. It's like a subtle form of manipulation, but not necessarily in a negative way.
Right.
It's about using your understanding of human psychology and social dynamics
to
create change organically.
Exactly. And it's a strategy that can be applied to all sorts of situations.
Okay.
From personal relationships to business negotiations to political movements.
Wow.
The key is to be patient, to be observant, to be willing to work behind the scenes.
Great.
And to understand that sometimes the most effective way to achieve your goals is to influence the environment itself, rather than trying to force your will upon it.
Wow, that's quite a powerful idea. And it really underscores the fact that strategy is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's about having a diverse toolkit, understanding the principles, and then applying them creatively to the specific challenges you face.
Absolutely. And that takes practice, experimentation, and a willingness to learn from your mistakes. The beauty of strategy is that it's a lifelong pursuit.
Right.
A constant process of learning, adapting, and evolving.
Well said. I think that's a great note to end on.
I agree.
We've explored the multifaceted world of strategy, from the basics to some truly unconventional approaches.
Yep.
Hopefully our listener now has a richer understanding of how these principles can be applied to all areas of life.
Absolutely.
And that's it for our deep dive into the world of strategy. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And until next time.
Keep strategizing.